Greetings, colleagues. My name is Herman Rosenfeld. I'm a retired staff person from the Canadian Auto Workers Education Department, and I work on a campaign called the Free Transit Campaign of Toronto, and I'm a member of a broader public transit users organization called TTC Riders, and an organization called Socialist Project. I'm speaking to you about the question, what if workers ran public transit? I've been asked to speak on this, and hopefully this will contribute to your discussions. First, I just want to make the point that it doesn't really make all that much sense to visualize working class people, those who work in the transit system, those who use it, and those who largely benefit from it, having serious power without imagining a series of political and class-based movements which create conditions for it to happen. We don't have these things in plenitude in Canada, and certainly not in its largest city, or neither in our friends to the south, in most of their cities as well. We do have some deep political and cultural traditions, at least in our largest urban centers, of having public transit be seen as a public service that is publicly owned and run, although with a terrible high fare box ratio. That is, very little money, almost no money coming from higher levels of government. So 70% in Toronto, think about this, of the operations of public transit is funded by the fare box, that is user fees, which is ridiculous. Regional commuter rail is owned and run by the province through a regional authority, but is constantly using forms of P3s to manage or maintain its newer projects. Larger rail and air transit is regulated, but the former, that is rail, is owned and run in a mix of public and private. The passenger rail is a shadow of what it once was. This country was built on passenger rail, actually, and it's state-owned through a crown corporation, but is somewhat subject to regular subsidy cuts and little by little options for using public rails across this very broad country, even across these really critical nodes across different parts of Canada, are cut. And freight is run privately. One of the main companies used to be publicly owned, but it too is a shadow of its former role. It's integrated with the United States, and it's been trumped in a lot of ways, but not always, by cars and trucks. The destruction of the larger rail networks is an untold tragedy in this country. But the key point here is that an alternative vision of how public transit is owned, managed, funded, planned, and how it interacts with other components of working class life is predicated or must be part of a larger movement to transform society. And as I said, we don't really have one of those. We have no socialist parties, and our mass movements come and go, but they don't have that kind of an orientation. Obviously, the trade union movement is a critical mass movement. It's around 30% in Canada today, and the union movement is weak, but it's not irrelevant. Its political orientation is moderately social democratic at best, and Canada's Social Democratic Party, called the New Democratic Party, has long ago made peace with the capitalist system as well as neoliberalism. It's not really a force for transformation, and it isn't all that different from the folks that have taken over the Labour Party in your country. Even more, the kinds of resistance to the effects of the system, and that resistance is there, it never goes away. Whether it takes the form of demands for higher minimum wages, challenging precariousness, fighting for housing, Medicare, public services, and public transit, never quite takes the form or language of class. And this is partially an effect of the lack of any real socialist presence in the political culture of the country, but also the effect of 40 years of neoliberalism. So I would begin by situating a move towards worker control or collective democratic power over public transit within the need for a larger movement that has a number of important characteristics. Working class oriented and sees its role as building a sense of working class interests and a challenge to both current neoliberal regimes and the capitalist system itself, which underpins it. Having a presence inside and outside the trade union movement, which is still the central place for working class people to organize. In working class community struggles, rooted in extra parliamentary movements, struggles and issues, as well as having an electoral presence, and capable of mounting a challenge in parliaments and local political battles. This is yet to be built, and a lot of us are involved in trying to build this and contribute to its building. Second, and getting into more of the concrete aspects of rail, we would have to renationalize and regulate freight rail and rebuild a passenger rail system funded by public taxation. And this obviously couldn't be done without nationalizing at least a good chunk of Canada's financial barons. Just like you have the City of London, which plays a very critical role in your economy, not necessarily a positive role, we have Bay Street. And making finance a public utility is a key element in actual funding the kind of public transit and rail networks needed in this huge country. Third, we would have to publicly fund public transport in all of Canada's cities. See, unlike Britain and a number of other countries, Canada has a federal system in the sense that its municipalities, like even Canada's largest city, are creatures of provincial governments. They set the tone for the rules for what we can tax, what powers we have. The U.S. is like that as well in relationship to states. So funding rules are different in each province, and the federal government has no regular mandated role in funding public transit. And in Toronto, there is no funding for the everyday operations for of public transit, for higher levels of government. And building new transit occurs in waves of political commitment, but is always shaped by narrow partisan approaches and goals that are articulated with neoliberalism and always have always are dominated by the particular balance of forces between different classes, and it's dominated by in this era for business. And that would have to change. We would need a guaranteed and adequate funding from the federal government and the provinces to guarantee that a plan for building, running, and maintaining public transit could actually be made. Public transit and the large rail network that needs to be built and maintained needs to be seen as a social right, tied to the right to choose levels of mobility, and as a key component of living, producing, housing, jobs, and the power to make collective and individual decisions about our economic and political lives. And last but not least, as a commitment to move towards sustainable forms of environmental living, of green living. And you might know, to get a sense of Canada, that there's two countries that have been, even behind Canberra, the laggards at the G7 discussions, even though it's mostly on paper, about addressing climate change, and Canada is one of them, Japan's the other. We need to plan for funding needs to be made by elected worker and user representatives, as well as those entrusted, delegated by elected representatives to oversee financial activities. Obviously, a democratic representative and effective process for deciding on funding needs to be the culmination of a series of participatory budgeting processes, and not the kind that are just for show, that simply are around the last level of what are we going to do around building or about fixing this street or fixing that street, but actually deciding democratically on how you fund things. Funding must be fully public, even though private actors, wealthy corporations, etc., must need to contribute to funding if the latter plays a subordinate role in the new economy. That is, if we have a different economy and there are private markets happening, the actors there need to pay. But whatever their funding rules, they cannot control the process of maintaining, managing, operating, or shaping transit in any meaningful way. The balance between private vehicle production and roads and public transit, rails, buses, airline, needs to be democratically decided, including production and research and development of how you do that, moving towards predominantly sustainable energy sources and collective forms of transit. Fourth, each community will have a say in deciding their public transit needs. There needs to be participatory planning processes that include residents of working class neighborhoods, workers on the transit system, and technical planning experts who need to be provided as resource people, so people have some base to make decisions, to look at their transit needs and make proposals for new ones. Along with a proper budget and with most jobs and significant percentages of housing provided through the public sector, transit planning needs to be integrated with other key aspects of working class life. This is a key point. Transit can't be separate from other components of social life for working people. People who live in suburbs or suburban-like neighborhoods that are part of cities or have been amalgamated into bigger urban conglomerations depend on cars to do their daily business. This needs to change, and it can't be changed by forcing people. You need planned intensification and municipalization of urban land, allowing lower-cost housing that is desirable inside central cities, and newly intensified suburban areas. And if there are public available transit options, people will be able to move away from cars. Housing has to be made affordable with different forms of housing options other than private ownership, and jobs need to be created within the distance to allow for public transit. And it also means you have a collective to decide what you're going to be producing locally, what's going to be produced nationally, and decisions about producing things and what services are made are not done by the market, are done by democratic planning methods. There needs to be equality and more openly public forms of recreation and living, which would be part, and small businesses and private services, which we know are necessary to grease the wheels of our living, need to be there as well. Fifth, public transit, like any other key sectors, needs to be managed and maintained through a series of councils that include workers, managers, many of whom will be workers at this point, and transit users. This will have to be fully public. Building new transit will be a combination of privately owned smaller contractors and large public pools of construction, managerial, technical groupings to build. How that would happen, it's hard to know. Right now, you mostly contract out to private contractors. How you balance that out, be interesting to figure out. It needs to happen. Right now here, a lot of this is increasingly privatized. That needs to be reversed. The way workers organize needs to be changed. Increasingly, lean production becomes the rule everywhere, the Toyotization of work. I know in rail it isn't quite the same, but that needs to be reversed as well, and different forms of organizing work that maintain people's capacity to have some kind of say, but don't waste resources, need to be developed. 6, transit workers' unions need to remain autonomous from the state, and political authorities as well, as must all trade unions throughout the economy. But they need to include their advocacy for the material conditions of our members, but also for the rest of the working class, rather than simply the narrow interests of our members in the short run, although they need to be balanced. Everyday operations and maintenance should be managed by some councils, which include blue and white collar workers. But increasingly, how do you merge those kinds of relations, that kind of work, along with technical expertise and representatives of public authorities responsible for their overall operations? Unions and workers' organizations need to develop their capacity to take positions on the shape and the future of their industries and sectors. And same thing with public transit. The transit unions in North America have taken, it's uneven in some cities, like Toronto, they've taken smaller steps and they finally have started to take positions on what they think transit will be like. And others, like the leading people around the International Amalgamated Transit Union in the U.S., usually they tend to be much conservative, are much more progressive. And it's quite interesting to see how those people are developing. But the relationship between workers, technical workers, transit users, and working class communities need to be handled. In those relations, there are all kinds of contradictions around those kinds of relations, and part of developing a democratic way of building is figuring out how to do that. And finally, public transit needs to be seen as a public service with fares playing a minimal role or a nominal role, and phased out through an ongoing process of decommodification. So, for example, you start with low-income passes for people who are poor and free transit for those on social assistance, disability, seniors, children, and students. You start lowering fares, you start freezing fares for everyone and start lowering fares with the principle of universality being the principle. You reduce personal car use through various methods. You raise funds until we have all these instruments at our command through higher income taxes, corporate taxes, development taxes, and yes, sales and consumption taxes. It's hard to visualize paying for how much all of these things without doing that. And in countries which have the richest public programs, they also have sales taxes, and you have to figure out ways to mitigate the cost on lower income people. And the balance between paying fares and freedom from fares needs to be decided democratically. Most of this is speculative, but there are examples of decommodified public transit, like Tallinn, for example, in Estonia, but not within a system of working class collective management. That's yet to be developed and decided. I hope this has helped to contribute to your discussions. Thank you.
So now we've got Janine. Okay, thanks very much. So following on from Herman's very interesting talk, I want to start by making a statement a bit of the obvious, but it's always good to start by stating the obvious, is that as socialists wanting a rational world, we favour public transport over private transport. And just to give you a few statistics that would underline some key reasons why. First of all, public transport is far, far safer than private transport. If you look at statistics in terms of deaths per billion passenger kilometres in the UK, top of the league is motorbikes with 93, then pedestrians 31, bicycles 27, cars 2, although cars cause most of the above, vans 1, and buses, coaches, rail and the air are 0. They're statistically negligible. So massively, massively safer public transport. And linked to that, the more public transport there is, and therefore the less private transport in society, the healthier people are going to be in terms of air quality and stuff like that. Look at environmental statistics. In 2011, road transport was by far the largest contributor to total transport greenhouse gas emissions. 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, transport greenhouse gas emissions were from road transport, and non-road or air transport accounted for only 6% of greenhouse gas contributions. The other 27% was from aeroplanes. Cars contributed 40% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So private transport is very, very bad for the environment, for health, for safety, etc. And another thing worth considering is land use. Cars, private transport, involves taking up far more land per person travelling than, for example, a railway track does, having that kind of impact on not being able to use the land for other rather more pleasant things. But transport under capitalism is biased towards private transport. Despite all these clear advantages of public transport, it's biased towards private transport because it's capitalism. So it's biased towards things that capitalists can make a profit from. So in the UK today, 83% of the distance travelled is travelled by car or van or taxi. And that's in 2013. In 2012, 64% of journeys were by car or van and only 3% by rail. Only 3%. You think of it as a dominant form of public transport, but only 3%. And in freight, the figures are quite shocking, I think. In 2010, 68% of freight was transported by road. So you'll notice this if you ever drive along the motorway, there's just lorries everywhere. If you're anything like me, you sit there at the wheel cursing for not being on the rail. Only 9% of freight was transported by rail, only 9%. The stuff that wasn't transported by road or rail was transported by water or by pipeline. And even the government funding, the public transport funding, the public sector funding you'd hope would go into public transport, but no, government funding for buses is going down. Public funding, it's been falling since 2010. Oh, was that when you were Tories were elected? And public funding for the railway is mainly just kind of siphoning through the railways and going into private companies. And yet in 2011-12, so only about 3 years ago, spending on private transport, the figure for roads, £7.1 billion was spent on roads, public money spent on roads in England alone. Use of public transport is prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. Rail fares continue to rise at a rate that's above inflation, while the cost of private motoring is rising, but only just, and rising at a lower rate than inflation is rising. On top of all that, public transport, much so we've seen its praises, it's been sold short by capitalism. It's not very accessible to disabled people, although its accessibility to disabled people is improving. It's not improving anything like as fast as it technologically could do if it was given a decent amount of priority. The coverage of public transport isn't as good as it could or we would want it to be, so there's still lots of parts that are inaccessible. And personal security on public transport is a problem for a lot of people. And one of the reasons a lot of people use private rather than public transport is they don't feel safe not in terms of train crashes, but in terms of personal security, i.e. the danger of assault or robbery, etc. Now I
We let that guy speak too long.
I should have put him on.
We've got plenty of time.
So this is the first bit of which I planned my book. I had this book published a year and a half ago called Plundering London Underground. And although it's specifically about the public-private partnership that New Labour inflicted on London Underground between 1997 and 2010, it does look at the history of London Underground and of the idea of workers' control in the future. And I kind of came up with a theory when I was researching the history of London Underground. London Underground is just over 150 years old. Those of you in London will have had the 150-year celebrations inflicted on you a couple of years ago. And it's really noticeable over those 150 years. It started private, it went public, it went private again, it fragmented, it united, up and down. And how well it does as a public service can be plotted alongside 5 factors. There are 5 factors, I believe, that shape how well London Underground does as a public service. And I think this is almost certainly true of public transport in general. Okay? 1, ownership. Does better, it's a better service when it's publicly owned than when it's privately owned. 2, integration. It is a better service when it's just run as one London Underground rather than this set of lines, that set of lines, cleaning contracted out, maintenance done by a different firm, etc. Thirdly, won't surprise you at all to know it does better when it's funded better. The more funding it gets, though, better it is. Fourthly, it's ethos. It does much better when it is allowed to function as a public service rather than as a business. Those of you with long memories might know that before 1984-85, London Underground was called London Underground. It was only then that it became London Underground Limited, with the London Transport Act of that year, which said, although it's publicly owned, it has to function. It is now a limited company with the government as its sole owner, and therefore must balance its books, and so on. And the 5th thing that shapes how well London Underground does is its governance. It does better when it is under the control of a London body rather than of a national body. And you can trace all this kind of thing through its history. Now, what I think is interesting about the discussion we're now today is, I think, for those of us on the left, transport, we don't have that many meetings about transport, do we? It's not, we don't have many demos or placards. We do kind of bang on about health and education and benefits and stuff, a lot more than we do about transport. Transport isn't a hugely sexy issue, is it, public transport? And actually, you'd be a push to be able to describe what the left's policy is on transport, other than that we're in favour of being publicly owned. Similarly, the unions. So I think everyone knows that lefties and unions think that public railways should be publicly owned, and probably think that staff should be paid quite well, and maybe they generally think it should be a bit better than it is now. But that's about as far as you'd know from what a general left attitude is. And I think it's really important that we look beyond the idea simply of nationalisation. I think we should keep saying we nationalise the railways and promote public ownership or something, but we have to go beyond nationalisation. So why is that? First of all, I actually think, maybe this is controversial, I don't know, that sometimes national ownership is not the ideal. I've just described how London Transport does best when it's in control of a London body. Sometimes we on the left can be very sloppy about our use of the word nationalisation. I am not in favour of London Underground being nationalised. I'm in favour of being in public ownership, but under the ownership of London government, not of national government. So when we mean public ownership, we should say public ownership, and only say nationalisation when you mean owned by the nation state. Also, the other reason why it's not enough just to say nationalisation or public ownership is that we know, not just in theory, but from many, many years of experience, that just because a public transport service is publicly owned doesn't mean it's brilliant. It can still be underfunded, it can still be forced to act like a business, it can still be very bureaucratic, it can still have a poor service. The national railways were publicly owned between 1948 and the early 1990s. And although British Rail was generally better and cheaper and safer than the private railway is now, I'm old enough to remember when it was just the butt of every stand-up comedian's routine, because it was actually a bit rubbish, and always running late, and there's endemic low pay as well. Railway workers are appallingly low pay at that time. So we have enough experience to know that nationalisation does not equal socialism, and doesn't even necessarily equal a great transport system. So what do we need as well as nationalisation? Well, first thing I think we need is planning. Just because the public can't control something unless it owns it, but just owning it doesn't mean it's going to be planned, because we've seen lots of these things owned publicly but still allowed to function to the diktats of the market. If we planned it, it'd be brilliant. We could decide, you know, if it was planned, then it could be, it could integrate different forms of transport. Replanning transport also enables you to replan a lot of the infrastructure and services. One of the things we have to remember about transport, I think Herman mentioned this as well, is it's not just this industry that runs in parallel with everything else, it's part of the social infrastructure. So if you run transport differently, you can start reshaping your city centres, you can start changing your land use, you can start relocating facilities and services and work and that kind of stuff. And if we did that, I think we'd find that demands for some aspects of public transport would go up, but demands for others would go down. For instance, I would love to see the end of the capital truck peak hours commute in London. And I think if we planned and replanned not just transport, but how work is done and how services are provided, then it would be possible to do that. Quite a good quote from a 1962 Communist Party pamphlet. So 1962, it was 14 years after the railways was nationalised, and they were explaining that railway renationalisation had been an extreme disappointment to railway workers. And they said, a nationalised industry can be wrecked if it is not allowed to plan, but it's restricted in the alleged interests of private enterprise. Okay? Very important point. But there's something missing from that quote, and it's missing from that quote because it's a quote from the Communist Party. And the thing that's missing is democratic planning. So what they're arguing for is like for it to be planned without saying anything about who's going to make these planning decisions. So it's very important we have a democratic process for planning transport that involves people. It ensures decisions are based on need. For example, one of the things that happens now in terms of prioritisation for new routes, right, the richest, latest luxury location or latest business centre is always prioritised over. I mean, this is why, for those of you living or familiar with London, the Jubilee Line extension was built more than a decade before what is now the London Overground East London route. Clearly much greater social need to link working class residential areas of North East London with working class residential areas of South East London. But poor Jubilee Line extension connected Docklands and Westminster. So that got the priority, that got the money. If we had democratic planning, we can prioritise the things that would benefit working class people. Quick look back to the experience of the 1930s. So the 1930s was when London passenger transport was brought into public ownership. It was privately owned until then, and it was just chaos. It was chaos. So it was brought into public ownership by the London Passenger Transport Act, which was drafted by Herbert Morrison, who was the Labour, remember the Labour government. And actually, by the time the Act came in, Labour was out of power. But the national government continued with his piece of legislation, which tells you something about how weak it actually was, and then prepared to do it. It was brought into public ownership, but under a board called the London Passenger Transport Board, which was dominated by the previous owners of the private lines that had just brought it into private ownership. They brought it into private ownership, from private to public ownership, and gave the private bosses all the seats on board, pretty much all the seats on board. Herbert Morrison described this as a measure of socialism. Ernest Bevin, not the most left-wing person in the history of the Labour movement, described it as positively the worst form of public ownership. And what actually happened was the service was crap, and there were protests, there was public, almost riots, protests by workers and passengers. And then it became really good, because that level of mobilisation forced the state to put a load of money into it. And they did a thing called the New Works Plan, which meant a load of the lines were extended and all that kind of stuff. Which means I can mention as an aside the idea of public works. In times, particularly in times, at any time really, but particularly in times of economic crisis, the left and the Labour movement have always argued for public works. You don't recover from economic crashes by austerity, Instead, you do the opposite. You spend money on extending public services to kill two birds with one stone, improve public services, and provide employment for people. And in the recessions, both in the 20s and the 30s, the government did public works. They put public money into London Underground in order to achieve those two aims. Those two governments were both Tory Liberal coalitions, strangely enough. So, if we don't want a board that's dominated by previous private owners, what sort of board do we have? Interestingly, I don't think Herman mentioned this actually, but in Canada in the 1920s, the Congress considered but rejected a scheme that was supported by the trade unions, where they said they wanted the National Railway Board to consist of 5 representatives of the public, 5 operating officials, i.e. railway bosses, and 5 members elected by employees. The ones to represent the public, by the way, wouldn't actually be elected by the public, they'd be appointed by the President. The President knows who represents the public. And in the 1930s, in London, the Communist Party proposed, instead of the London Passenger Transport Board having all these private owners on it, it should consist of 5 municipal authority reps and 2 employee reps. So 5 people from the London Borough Council, plus 2 elected by the staff. But I think we need to stop here and think, well, yeah, maybe that would be more democratic, maybe that would be a bit better. The TfL board, Transport for London board now is a load of mayoral appointees, handpicked by Boris Johnson, bunch of Tories, bunch of business people, so one private hire, 1 cab trade bloke, Tanny Gray Thompson's a token disability representative, and Brendan Barber, who doesn't answer his phone to the transport unions, and hasn't done a thing about the fact that they're cutting loads of jobs and wanting to bring drivers, trains and stuff. So obviously, a democratic board would be better, but the problem is, if you just put a democratically elected board on top of an existing structure where you've still got managers and you've still got no workplace democracy, no industrial democracy, then the people on that board are just going to get sucked into acting like senior managers and become bureaucratised. In the 1930s, there was a fellow called, I think, John Cliff, who was a T&G official, who joined the board and left his position in the T&G and just became a board member like anyone else. But that allowed them to make it look like there's workers' representation on the board when in practice there wasn't. The rank and file group that operated on London Transport in the 1970s, one of their key demands, their list of their platform of 10 or whatever demands, one of their key demands, no trade union reps on the London Transport board. Because they saw that would suck into the bureaucracy. So, but we do, and I think the crucial thing here is not having an elected board on top of a bureaucratic, undemocratic structure. You need workers' control in the day-to-day running of the transport operation as well. Why? Because we know best. I mean, whenever you're at work, the people you're on with, there's always some point during the day, no matter what their politics are or how apolitical they are, there's always some point during the day where someone goes, slags up something a manager's done and says, you know, they don't know how the system works, we do, we could do it better. I'm sure that's the same wherever you guys work as well. Yeah, I think it's here. I can carry on, I'm doing well, that's all right. I'm going to take workers' control of my own speech and speed up the service. So that's what we want to do. What we want to do, because we can do it, is manage without managers. One of the things we are always saying to each other, working with the underground, is when we go on strike, right, next Thursday, that's the next time, when we go on strike, the whole of London comes to a stop. If all the managers went on strike, no one will notice for 6 months. Right, they go off on a way day team building exercises, and amazingly enough, the trains keep running. Yeah. We can manage without managers, partly because they just do a load of useless stuff like disciplining people and filling in irrelevant forms. The stuff they do that is of any relevance, like rostering or whatever, workers could do maybe on a rotational basis. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with the factory occupation movement in Argentina maybe about a decade ago. There's a brilliant video of one of them where they do, all the managers just ran away and left this tile factory, the workers took it over. The workers had just worked on the production line producing tiles. They hadn't done any of the managerial stuff. They thought only clever people could do that. And only real experts could do that. It's a fantastic interview with this woman where she explains that now instead of doing 5 days a week on the production line, everyone does 4 days a week on the production line and 1 day carrying out managerial tasks. And what she's doing is budgeting. She's doing the money. And she said, it's incredible. All these years I thought it was really hard. I've just got it piss easy. They've just been making out like it's rocket science. And it isn't, you know? Yeah. And I think we would have the same experience with workers' control of the railways. So I think that public transport would be its best if it was run by workers and passengers. So I talked about workers on the railways day-to-day operation, but in general I think it's workers and passengers. It's not just the workers who work on the underground, but it's the other workers who travel on the underground as well. And by passengers, I kind of mean potential passengers as well as actual passengers. I mean the passengers that can't be passengers now because they can't get in and out of the stations or it doesn't run to the place they live. One of the first things we do with elected worker and passenger bodies is open the books, have a look at the finances, see where the finance is bleeding out of the system into private companies, decide where we want the money to be spent. Even Trotsky had something to say about this in the transitional programme. He said the abolition of business secrets is the first step toward actual control of industry. Transport should be placed under an observation glass. To meet the cost by making the rich and big business pay. There's various ways of taxing that, which is one of the things people might want to talk about. Just to point out that in France, they have a thing called a transport tax, where in every district with more than 100,000 people, every employer with more than 9 workers has to pay a certain amount of transport tax. So it's approaching 2%, I think, and it just gets spent on transport. And there are certain areas where that's raised enough money for transport to be entirely free. So there's a place called Pays de Bagne, which is one of the free public transport areas in France. It's all in my book, which is on sale. And this is how a spokesperson describes the effect. They increased ridership by 170% and half the cost per passenger when they abolished fares. Free transport means equality. Everyone can use these public services as they need. There is no city centre reserved for a few. There are no inaccessible villages. The lower income housing estates are disenclaved, I love that word, and everyone goes where they want in complete freedom. Herman also mentioned Tallinn. I went there a couple of years ago. It's the capital of Estonia. They make public transport free for people, unfortunately for people who live in Tallinn. But it's improved air quality by 15% and reduced congestion and noise. And there is a credible plan for free public transport, urban public transport in New York City called the Peel Plan, which I would recommend anyone to read. What might we plan if we're in charge? Well, I suggest that the agenda of the first meeting might include cutting fares, expanding services, maintaining adequate staffing levels, better safety, state-of-the-art train protection measures, for instance, abolishing level crossings by building tunnels under or bridges over, because people get killed on those every year. Introducing new technology to work with staff instead of replacing staff, massively increasing disability access, improving comfort. I think my particular bugbear is, I kind of like the idea of play carriages on trains where kids can just, where there's toys and games and stuff, and the kids can have fun rather than get bored and not upset everyone else. Or open tops train carriages for weather like this. Prompt repairs and good quality maintenance, and changing our cities. If we controlled the transport, what could we do in London? If no one was having to use cars anymore because the transport was much better. And big pedestrianised areas, huge, comfortable, enjoyable city squares, all that kind of stuff. So, in conclusion, what we need is a workers and passengers plan. That, I think, should be the slogan for socialists to advance for transport, beyond just saying nationalise these or pay the workers more or don't cut that or whatever, right? The workers and passengers plan, drawn up and overseen by a democratically elected governing body of workers, passengers and the community, and that placing transport under working class control will be a core part of reorganising society as a whole on a more rational basis.
Thanks, Janine. Right, we've got about half an hour for questions, discussion, debate, and then I'll bring Janine back just for 5 minutes at the end, or if there's any gaps as we go along, she might want to come back sooner. So, can I see anybody? Yeah.
Well, it's a question to Janine, slightly provocative, but nevertheless, it would actually come up in the operation of the workers who are in control of the railways. One is discipline. You just jumped over, it's called an implication under early socialism. We wouldn't need to discipline people. I don't believe that's true. Sorry, the state, workers' control, whatever, would sack people. So I'd like you to hear your views, unless you think that that will never happen. Secondly, provocatively, driverless trains. Under socialism, I don't understand socialism just freezing every work system in operation under capitalism, and saying, that's it. I want to reduce people's hours. I actually want to abolish drudgery work. But clearly that would actually mean in certain positions actually get rid of people or replacing people. Clearly that would be in a different context from society now, which is obviously you just dump people and you think, I don't care where they go, I don't care what happens to them. But nevertheless, it does seem to me, unless a vision of socialism is just literally freezing the world, and everybody's got a job, continues it regardless of technology, etc. But that socialism, I have to be honest, I don't want that. I want actually decreasing amounts of people working. I want ever increasing hours, etc. And part of that could actually be getting rid of all drivers in order to actually free people up and also to actually reduce costs. I did deliberately provocative because sometimes when we conceive of the future, and obviously there's always difficulty because actually the future we want by struggle. And so what we have is actually maybe not precisely ideally what we want. So for instance, when the Bolsheviks took power, if you had asked them 20 years or 10 years back, what would happen, they would have actually conceived of a different world, a different sort of concept. I mean, Lenin had a notion, for instance, on administration, that capitalism has simplified management so much that I think he described it as the post office, is that all big corporations were like the post office. All you need to do was get rid of one or two people and the workers just run it because they had simplified administration so much. I'm not sure that's true, at least initially. So really what I'm trying to get is not that I disagree with the broad thrust. Clearly planning is vitally important. Clearly workers' control in terms of rostering, maybe self-discipline, etc. is obviously vitally important. Clearly we would actually run them in a different way in terms of, say, ticketing, etc. Though, to be blunt, I would have electronic tickets. I mean, it would be just bizarre if you go back to some sort of system. I suppose actually what possibly too sharp a point, but nevertheless I think it's important to look at, is a conception of socialism which is just basically capitalism, but we rewind everything that the RT doesn't like. Is actually my idea of socialism. I mean, to use a crude terminology, socialism is not electrification plus the RT sort of policy conference. It's actually fucking more. And that would actually bring us in, potentially, into arguments, disputes with actually unions. That's why obviously I'm in favour of unions being independent. We'll see how long it will be, but they have to be independent because actually, to be blunt, they would have to fight the workers' state in some ways. Because to believe that somehow we'd be synonymous in all circumstances, I think would be wrong. Clearly we'd be infinitely more sympathetic and we'd be looking for deals. But to believe that somehow we abolish class struggle, we abolish class antagonism, exploitation, etc., in a certain sense, the workers will reduce that, but at least in the initial stage, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about ultimate socialism, I'm talking about the situation we could find ourselves. Is clearly we could find ourselves in all sorts of actually disputes with people. But coming back to the main thing, if socialism is just capitalism frozen, but we rewind and take away certain things, like we don't like to let our ISA cards because we want ticket apples. I'm being deliberately provocative here. I don't want that. I want something better. I want reduced numbers of people working. I want reduced hours, etc., etc.
Bloody hell. Bending the stick, John.
If you think socialism is just going to be all
You just bugging up my desire to become a train driver when I retire from teaching.
But you're never going to retire, Lee. You like it too much. Socialising our children.
You're going to be train driver. I'm not going to come. I'm going to leave to cover what John said to Janine, which she'll know more than that. But I just want to pick up on a couple of things just in my own walk to speak. I mean, what Janine said about the way the workplace runs applies to virtually any workplace. Taking away what John just said, and I understand what he said to an extent, but I mean, I deal with a lot of discipline cases in the workplaces, and I'd say 85–90% of them are entirely unjustified, and are just a complete waste of time of the people who are involved in the disciplining, who are by and large total wankers, and the people who are having to go and represent the members like me, because they're just vindictive processes. And also they're an illustration of the fact that in the last 20 odd years, workplaces have become more and more controlled by systems of micromanagement. And those systems of micromanagement don't lead to a better service, they lead to a worse, much, much worse service. And the people who run those micromanagement systems take their orders from above, and so they're not interested in the quality of the service at all. They're only interested in making sure they follow the correct orders. So in schools, for example, the people who manage schools are obsessed with what Ofsted tell them or what the government tells them. But I just want to illustrate something about, because one of the things that happened in the 1960s, because I know because I live right next to it, right next to one example of it, is that a load of railway lines were closed down by beaching, who incidentally, I mean, there was a guy in the Middle Ages who translated the Bible into English, and eventually when it was discovered who did it, his body was dug up and he was hung, drawn and quartered after he was dead. He'd been dead 20 years or
That
something.
was teaching.
Sorry? That'll teach him. But however, there is a case for now, today, doing that to beaching, if there is somewhere where you could dig him up, because what he did was just like die. One of the consequences of what he did was he closed the last main line that was built in Britain, which ran from Marylebone Station to Manchester. I know one thing about that because I went there taking pictures this morning. Because that railway line also happens to run by the bottom of my garden, so I could theoretically also go to IFF from the bottom of my garden, which would have been really nice. Just from a personal point of view, not to mention the benefits it would have given to the rest of society. But that railway line also happens to run more or less close to the M1. And at the time it was closed, the M1 was being built, more or less right next to it. It also runs straight from Nottingham to London, whereas the one that's there now runs west for about 15 miles before it turns south. It doesn't go through such populated areas, so the reason it was closed was to do with so-called capitalist economics. Now they're opening chunks of it all over the place to run other bits of transport. The bits they haven't buried, most of the line in Nottingham itself is completely disappeared. But part of it's going to be a new tram line. Bits of it are the tram line. And there are bits of it other places also. So I think the way that went, the way that happened, and the way the beaching came about was partly because you had a state, the type of nationalised industry that Janine was talking about and condemning, and not sufficient workers' control and workers' understanding of what this would mean in the future. Imagining the future, because actually, even from a capitalist point of view now, the closing of the Great Central Railway is completely economically madness. Given what's the state of our transport system now. So I think those sorts of things. And just one last thing. Janine was talking about, how you could make it easier to use public transport. I mean, I think if you ask most people who use cars, this is certainly the case for me, you would literally kill to get out of your car and get on a train. I mean, I came today on the 6:32 train from Nottingham. I spent 2.5 hours looking at Marylebone Station because it's just nicer to be sitting on a train going to London than it is to be driving down the M1. And I think most people, given the right set of circumstances, would believe that. And that's why I think what Janine talked about control by passengers and workers together is a good way to imagine the future.
Yeah.
I don't entirely disagree with you about driverless trains. I think that we should advance technology. If we have advanced technology that lightens the burden of labour on people, because I don't drive a train, you drive trains, you possibly don't think it's actually a really fascinating, brilliant thing. However, lots of people do want to drive trains, and even if you have driverless trains, it doesn't stop people sitting at the front if they cannot want to do that thing. And and that might also, you could have useful functionality for people to do that if they wanted to do it. I like sitting at the front of the Dublin Light Railway, even though it's driverless. That's great, nice. But I think it is actually. I think the reason I like this session is I think there are some. It resonates with some discussions I was having this morning, in fact, which is about Heathrow. And there is, of course, that's the mass transit issue. There's another runway. The economic case for it is absolutely sound. Everybody, all the experts agree. Politicians don't agree because it's a vote loser. The people who are opposing it are people who have basically they're worried about the loss of value of their homes. And in fact, very frequently, and I know this because I live next to a railway line, and that rail line was developed so that it would have more frequent trains running on it and running later, and they put cleaning and a repair station next to where I live, and so there was a lot of additional disruption, and there were local community meetings about that issue, and the majority of people there, the majority of people who certainly were homeowners, just didn't like it. They just didn't like the idea of, they knew that they would massively benefit from this railway, from this extension of this line, from the improved service, and from more, their local station had better services more frequently. But the immediate effect on them, close to home, was quite bad, and they were opposed to it. Now, I was fortunate. I went to those meetings with a couple of other people, and we negotiated with the people making it in good faith, as you would. We approached it as we would do if we actually controlled that situation. So we went into those meetings in a, we're the ones in control here, we're the ones making the decision, and we put forward proposals which they accepted, because everybody else was just being, no, don't do it. Okay, so what I'd like to ask is, how would we deal with those larger scale issues? So for example, our potential, in that weird dichotomy where the potential beneficiaries of an extension of a rail line might also be the people who would oppose the building of that railway line. Those things currently are dealt with in, I think, they're very difficult to deal with right now. The big public meetings, and there are, as I say, I've been to some of them, and they're just, you have a panel of experts, 3 experts there, people who've spent perhaps 18 months of their life working out exactly how this is going to fit together and how it's going to benefit the community, and they've looked into all of the analysis of it, and they've got an hour and a half meeting to try and convince the community of that, those benefits, and take on board what they have to add, and then cycle that back in. So I suppose what I'm saying is that I don't think any of this is possible without there being a much broader social revolution. I think people would have to be much more used to having discussions about difficult issues, about being much more familiar with having to make compromises, and to look at how other people view things. So I don't know. I mean, how do you? That's certainly not the way I think it would have to work. But do you think that there are practicalities in things like a new runway, for example, and the railway infrastructure, and those long-scale planning aspect to it? If we have more democracy, will the risk of that be, so for example, the London-based transit system London is controlling the London-based transport system, how does that echo out with the Nottingham-based people running their transit system, and how do we ensure that those two things communicate and that it isn't going to be a whole giant mess?
Okay, a couple of things. As one of the drivers in the room, although I'm just a trainee, I do completely agree with you about driverless trains. I got up at 5:30 this morning to drive one, but I primarily did it because they paid me. So I don't know if I'd do it for fun if I lived under a system where that wasn't the necessary arrangement for my continued existence. I think probably most drivers would feel the same as well. But that's not the question we immediately face, obviously, under it. If there's an attack on drivers on trains on the underground, say, or it becomes in the main. Of course, yeah. I'm sort of saying that you still need to campaign, apply the works movement. But if you could, under a system of democratic socialist planning, devise some method of lessening the amount of work required to do something, then I think that's really good. And you could free up those people to do things on the road that actually people would want more labour being spent on, like what we call now customer service, but just helping people out and making the journey kind of pleasant and nice, and doing all the various things that at the moment cause delays because there just isn't anyone to do them, like assisting passengers, all sorts of things, or not, people do something else with the time. But you can have a democratic discussion about that. I think me and another member of Work Cities, also a trained driver, were having a discussion the other day about the fact that this raised a couple of things, but Janine said and Herman said in his video. there's about 150 drivers being made redundant at the moment on, I think it's DB Schenker, which is one of the freight companies, that primarily in the north of England, because they've got less and less work transporting coal. Which is relevant to this discussion for like all sorts of reasons. It ticks a lot of boxes here. Because what would you say? Like obviously those people are going to be out of jobs, but the fact that less coal is being used is probably no bad thing. What should be the programme of workers' representatives with regards to their jobs? You can't just say like, well, keep the work, campaign to keep that work, because it's probably good that work is not being done. I mean, you could raise the demand of like, well, as we discussed, like, you could raise the demand of a democratic system of planning would maybe move freight off of rails, off of roads onto rails, for all the reasons Janine was talking about, to keep those jobs. But then, of course, you would lose jobs on the road. I think it does just come down to the fact that if there is less work that needs to be done, people should work less. Like, if less work is required to keep the overall division of labour that maintains our society, then that's a good thing. Were we in control of that overall division of labour that keeps our society going? The fact that it is run on the basis of a motive just entirely, how can we make most money out of this, is what leads something that actually could be to a great many people's benefit to be something that is going to put 150 people out of work. So it once again underscores the fundamental fact that even to have this discussion about like, what should we do with those 150 people requires us as a society to be in control of that question. And we are not in any way in control of that question, which is why it's so fucked up that we end up arguing for, no, keep the jobs for the people taking coal to power stations. We don't want to be burning coal, because otherwise they're out of work. So yeah, the other thing I would agree with you on actually is that still we would need discipline, and that is true because it is a workplace in which mistakes and a lax attitude to the tasks you're performing can kill people, which is no doubt true in a lot of workplaces, but I think that therefore applies kind of across the board. But what I would say from my experience of it is changing the attitude towards discipline, i.e. not having managers who view it primarily as a method of maintaining control over their workforce, would drastically change the attitudes of staff towards it, i.e. just help maintain a level of professionalism, which I feel is actually quite, is better on the whole than any other place I've worked, but still would be much better were it not for the fact that you often feel like if you want to act professionally in a certain situation and report something as a safety concern, you are going to put someone out of job and make their life miserable, which shouldn't be the case necessarily. Just a brief example, sorry for going on, but when I was working as a guard, part of my duties was to make sure when you get out of a station, you open the door, get out on the platform, and make sure the driver stops the train in the right place, so that you're not opening doors onto the live rail and all sorts. You don't know who's getting out, and when they can see that there is no platform there, it's just going to be dropped. Or whether they'll just think, nah, I'll solve it, and go for it. But the problem is, like, I knew if I got out that train and did what I was supposed to do, which is looking at the back three coaches are on the drivers, forgotten that we've got 8 instead of 4, and report it, because who knows, it might be a recurring problem at that station, it might be a recurring problem with that diagram, it causes fatigue, and people forget, it might be because it's scheduled to immediately, who knows what, it should be an issue that's reported and followed up on, and some kind of action plan works up to resolve it. If I do that, and just go, that person's going to now be at medium risk, they're going to be on an action plan, they're possibly going to lose their job for something that could be resolved just by me phoning up and saying, could you pull forward to me? Like, no unsafe situation has been created, you just move it forward. And so it actually, this level, the way in which discipline is structured, because of a capitalist society, because of the need to control the workforce, inhibits professionalism amongst workers.
Right, I've got one more person who's indicated to speak. Is there anybody else who wants to come in? Okay, then I'll take Rosie and then we'll bring you in to come back. You can have a reasonable amount of time to come back.
Sure.
Okay. So Rosie.
I can't speak very loud. Couple of things, just a couple of things that Mike was just saying then. I think the thing about disciplinaries is, I've worked in the health service, and there were increasing numbers of discipline. I mean, I worked in the community in a not very vindictive management situation, but as I was leaving, as we've been transformed into the CCGs and tendering out and the separation between the provider and the purchaser, that was getting worse. But a lot of the disciplinaries were about people not managing to work to a system that was designed to basically not perform to pay us, but to kind of identify every single minute of a community nurse's day, to log everything, and the people who couldn't work like that through a computer and diarify everything, they were the people who were being called up for disciplinaries. Which obviously, in those kind of situations, those are the disciplinaries where we're saying, look, is the system a problem, people are doing their job, this is a good nurse, there's no clinical problems. But there were people I worked with where really shit. And if you're caring for people in a vulnerable situation, you can't do those jobs if you're shit. There are some people who have taught my children who aren't fit to teach children. And that's a problem for us. And so the issues of disciplinaries and how we will deal with that, I mean, I know it's a bit an OT thing, an opposite thing, but I think it is, but I suppose the big difference that always comes down to my head is that if we think someone isn't capable of doing the job they're doing, what we're not saying is you sack them and throw them on the heap. That everyone's capable of something. You know, your first port of call is always extra training, support, trying to find out if there's any problems, but basically you have to sometimes say, look, you can't do that job. So I think we would have to say that as socialists, don't allow people to be put in an unsafe position. And it's kind of similar to, you mentioned the thing about coal. So look at the miners' strike. If the miners' strike and the closure of the pits had primarily been at a time when CO2 emissions was the big thing, we wouldn't have said, well, yeah, we need to close the pits. Because under this system, what they would do would be the same thing. Because under this system, that's about jobs and livelihoods and communities. And they aren't about to give all those people something else. So, you defend jobs. If that's what those communities want to do, you defend jobs and say, no, you don't shut those pits until you find something else for every single person, with no loss of earnings, with retraining, with blah, 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 It's that thing where, we would defend those 150 jobs, wouldn't we? Or our position would be, you keep paying those people or you redeploy them and you do something else. So I think the thing about the dropping out is, of course we want to see less work. Of course we want to use technology to take the burden of people doing work, but it would simply be that those individuals who would work less hours would not have any financial suffering as a result of that. I find the thing about the whole Oyster cards, keeping Oyster cards or having a ticket hall a bit weird, because I just think we would get rid of barriers and tickets. But I remember when I lived with Janine, and she was on the underground, and I got a spousal pass, like a phone pass, and it was like socialism. Oh, you know, somewhere. I could just go get a bus, train. Don't have to worry if I have 50p in my pocket or whatever, however much it costs these days. £2 for a bus fare. I just got the ticket out and I went and got on a train. And then when I moved out, then I hadn't wanted dodges, but then when he left the underground, I had to pay for my transport, and it cost so much. And it took me ages to get used to it. That privilege, that wonderful thing of thinking, I'm going to go here, and I'm just going to go and get on a bus. Because that's public. I'm going to go and get on a train and go there. And I don't have to, obviously I still have a ticket, but I don't have to pay any money. And you wouldn't have Oyster cards or ticket halls. You'd have someone on the station to make sure people were right and knew where they were going. But you wouldn't have, But surely, under socialism, one of the first things we do is we will be funding it through taxation. And I mean, I remember going to Liverpool actually as a child. I think it must have been when the Millies were in charge of the council, and it was 5p on the dice. 5p. And we came from London with 5p, 70p in London. You know, even a nominal thing would be, you know. But I think as soon as possible you'd go to this idea that you've no barriers, you walk on the train, you walk off the train, and nobody's taking a ticket. It's your right to travel. So I think the driverless trains thing. I'll just say one more thing, which is yes, I'm for technology. Technology is only as good as the people who run it. And the fact is that when you've got high-moving electrical stuff on a train, I want a person there who's trained, who knows how it all works, and checks the trains in the right place. And they might be driving, they might not be driving, but there's a place for a person on the train. And I don't think we're anywhere near a technology that just, you know, don't have. And also because you don't want to de-skill people as well, you know, we want the public, we want more people to understand how things work, don't you? Not less.
Right, thanks. We've got about 8 minutes to come back on all of that, so good luck.
Okay. So, discipline, under socialism would be sacked people. Look, there's people I'd sacked under capitalism. Quite a lot of the managers on the underground staff. But also, there's workers I can't be quite happy to see sacked. About 15 years ago or so, Hannah was subjected to an appalling campaign of sexual harassment when she was the only woman driving on the Bakerloo line. And the bloke got sacked. Good. Piss off. Don't, you know, we don't want you at work sexually harassing people. So yeah, I'm in favour of discipline. But I also agree with Liam when he says, look, 80% of the disciplinaries I go to, and he's London Underground, the clear majority of disciplines are for sickness absence. Right? They are for being ill twice in 6 months. And you automatically get a warning if you're ill twice in 6 months. I would say probably the next biggest group is probably for making mistakes. And mistakes that are either actually caused by the intolerable working conditions you're working in, you're trying to do, you know, you're on your own on a ticket barrier that used to have 3 people on it, and you make a mistake with someone's ticket, or you're knackered from a week of dead early starts and you lose your temper with somebody who's being out like an arse and they complain about you, stuff like that. Or they're a mistake that they're just, you know, everyone makes mistakes. Are we in favour of dealing with that by putting someone on the final warning and making them terrified of losing their livelihood? Discipline would look very different, I think. It would look very, very different. It would be less adversarial. It would be more about, you know, the extreme end of it would be, do you know what, mate? Railway's not for you. Let's talk about, you know, maybe you'd be better off as a nurse or a gardener. So that would be the extreme end of it, I think. Otherwise, it's just a matter of improving, you know, what is it about your working conditions that's led you to make this mistake? Maybe we'll change the working conditions rather than you know, take it all out on you. Next thing. Is this about freezing every work system? Absolutely not. I mean, the one thing I thought I'd clearly not argued for was keeping things the same. I hope that my talk at the beginning was about having to change transport and wouldn't be mistaken for one that was about defending the way things operate now. In fact, my driving motivation behind kind of formulating this policy about a workers and passengers plan, a workers controlled railway, is about, part of it is about trying to shift the unions, which are so conservative and defensive, away from being conservative and defensive about everything the way it's run now, towards advocating a positive alternative. I don't think the unions should just say, you know, more pay, no driver's trainers, keep to jobs. No to this, scrap that, stop the other, etc. They shouldn't just say that, partly because it's so bloody uninspiring to just say no to things. The unions would win a lot more public support if we said, here is our alternative vision for transport in London, or in Nottingham, or in Liverpool, or across the country, or what have you. So I am, you know, me and RMT policy is not the same thing. And it's often on issues like this that I'll end up having a row. I remember arguing with Bob Crow objected about free travel, for instance. Me saying we should be in favour of it, and him saying absolutely not, jobs, blah, 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 blah. I don't think that policy might shift now, because it's very hard for the unions now to say we need to defend jobs in ticket collection when they're all being scrapped. But nonetheless, if you look at things like plans for free public transport, I really would, people are interested enough to come to this session rather than any of the competitors, then you're probably interested enough to have a look at the Kiel plan. K-H-E-E-L, right? It's Kiel plans for free public transit in New York City. It's really detailed. And one of the things it does, they're concerned about the unions, what they'll say, is they say, but they figured it out, okay? They figured it out that it can be done without lots of jobs. Because they tie it all in with a bit of congestion charging, a bit of replanning of New York, an extension of suburban light rail and all that, and they work out that if you do what they're suggesting, and fund it in the way they're suggesting, then they will increase services, and anyone who currently works checking tickets, or selling tickets, or whatever, would get a job doing that. There'd be a bigger fleet of trains that would need more maintenance staff, etc. And I mean, I agree with Rosie about it. I can't be asked having an argument about paper tickets versus oyster tickets. I don't want there to be fares. And I kind of think 5p in Liverpool, right? Why bother allocating resources to collect 5p pieces? It probably costs about 5p for every 5p you collect. Probably all the 5p's were spent on collecting the 5p's. If it's going to be that low, you may as well not have the tickets at all. Driverless trains, theoretically, yes, we could oppose things now that we wouldn't oppose under socialism, but again, I agree with Rosie on this. I suppose it is theoretically conceivable that in a different sort of society, driverless trains may be, but we are so far from that, because trains don't just need driving in perfect line conditions. Possibly a train could drive itself where no one jumps in front of it, no one's standing too close to the edge of the platform, nobody drops their mobile phone in front of the next one coming in, no one's kids are roller skating down the platform. There's no, all that, there's no storms which blow trees over the lines right in front of the train. But all these things happen, and they happen a lot. And the technology does not exist to protect the passengers on that train from those instances that is a match for a human being on the front of the train doing it. It just doesn't exist. And I think we're a long way from making it exist. Jim, Heathrow. I think the objections to, I'm not sure this is what you're saying, but I think the idea that the objections to Heathrow runway are just about kind of NIMBYism is false. And in particular, I don't think it's just about the value of people's houses. I think it's about them wanting to sleep at night. And wanting to live in there's one village where half the village is either side of a road, and half of it, the one on that side of the road, is going to be flattened. And there's elderly people who've lived there for decades and decades, whose houses are going to be just destroyed. So I think people's concerns are a bit more, a bit more about social comfort, etc., than just about the price of their houses. But I also think there is a broader and very, very valid concern about the volume of air transport. I think probably, if I was in a particularly assertive mood and I was the Secretary of State for Transport, I would ban domestic flights. Yeah. Why on earth does everyone need to fly within Britain? There's possibly I wouldn't ban them, say, in Russia, but in Britain, the only reason people are flying from London to Glasgow is that, you believe it or not, cheaper than going on the train. Which is ridiculous. One of the reasons it's cheaper than going on the train, by the way, is that aircraft fuel is not taxed and train fuel is taxed. Okay, so, and I'd also find some mechanism of stopping business people flying the world every other week to meetings that they could very easily have on Skype. They just make them, because they're just using the money they've extracted from their workers and their customers to fund an unnecessary jet-setting lifestyle because they like travelling around the world.
Put them up against the wall and shoot them.
Yeah. That also would be useful.
That's a bit timid.
The other interesting comparison is parallel with the Heathrow thing is HS2, the high-speed rail network, where, and this is one of the things which very interesting and enjoyable to witness. One of the very rare things that John McDonnell and Bob Crow ever rowed about. And they would row about that, and they would row about it from their own sectional concern, right? And Bob's bothered about the railway jobs, and John's the MP for an area that HS2 goes through, okay? But the fact is that the Tories' plans for, and previous and probably late plans as well, for HS2 would tunnel under Tory constituencies and drive through working class constituencies. Literally they would. So Tory MP in the Midlands objected, don't like HS2, it's going to go through my nice green and pleasant land. And Tory said, all right, then we'll do the tunnel. But we don't mind it just goes straight through Euston and straight through Hillingdon and what have you. Finally, the DB Schenker thing. If I was in DB Schenker, the freight rail thing, I absolutely think the main thing they should be saying is freight off the road onto the rail. Yeah. Right? Maybe not coal. If we're losing the work moving coal, you know, all that stuff that's clogging up the motorways all the time, moving everything from loads of Hovis to cars or whatever, it should be on, and I would like to see the unions, what the unions are doing at the moment is negotiating terms of redundancy. Right, rather than negotiate terms of redundancy, they should be putting forward an alternative, and the alternative is you can keep these jobs, and by doing this, by moving freight from the roads to rails, and what a bonus! Not only do you keep jobs, you also decongest the roads, which means fewer people get asthma, which means fewer people get killed in crashes, which means fewer cyclists die on London's roads because there's too many freight lorries around. So, oh, I think I've covered everything. Although one thing I didn't mention, all these ideas are expanded on in the final section of my book, Plundering London Underground, which is £12.95 in the shops, but available to you today for special Ideas for Freedom price of £10.
Thanks very much, Janine. There's a break now, but people